Well, we'll get started. I was talking.
I'll sit in the back.
I'm intrigued by the fact that ancient Israel had a time when there was no Messiah tradition. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, there's no Messiah tradition because there was no kingship. Kingship comes at about 1000 BCE with Saul, David, and Solomon. We can go there, Sue, to the next slide. If you just watch me. The memories of the Messiah tradition really start when you have kingship. It's interesting. We wonder how much of it was in the ancient Near Eastern world from other cultures. Pharaoh and the kings in Babylon and Assyria. Whether there was anointing, I really don't know. But it seems to be that some holy man or someone seemed to give a certain sanctity to the royal house of each country. And so we have this tradition of the anointing of Saul by Samuel. Samuel took a vial of oil and poured it on his head and said, "The Lord has anointed you ruler over his people Israel. You shall reign over the people of the Lord. You will save them from the hand of their enemies all around." And that seems to be the origin of kingship. We have the 12 tribes and the charismatic leaders who just kind of rise up like Saul did, just being a kind of the leader of a tribe. And it's kind of, if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately because of the Philistine threat was after one tribe after another. And so the need was to combine the 12 tribes under one leader, which is how they appointed Saul, because he really was a strong man. I mean, he was seen as a great warrior. And so Samuel anoints him. That's the memory, at least, that's preserved in 1 Kings. And then David after him, because Saul was very disappointing. He seems to have been neurotic or probably psychotic in that he had fits of temper tantrums. And so Samuel feels called by the Lord to seek out a son of Jesse. Well, whatever that means, it's the legend or the tradition that's preserved in 1 Kings. And it's a beautiful story as Samuel goes to the house of Jesse and he examines all of the 7 sons of Jesse, and he doesn't find the right one. And he said, "Don't you have any other sons?" He said, "Yes, the youngest, but he's out taking care of the sheep." And he said, "Well, send for him. I need to see him." It's as though it's kind of a miraculous perception that the right one will be the one that he's supposed to anoint. That's the way Samuel remembers the story. And there is this little passage, and I got this in German from Wittenberg, and I've kept it in German, this wonderful phrase from 1 Samuel. But the Lord does not see as mortals see. They look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart, from 2 Kings 16:7. I've got that framed in St. Paul as a text from 1 Samuel, but that it's beautiful, the language, that this is what the tradition says, that God saw that that David had a certain purity of heart, even as a boy. So David comes to court at Saul with his lyre. He's a singer. He becomes Saul's armor bearer, and he's in the court, familiar. And then when the saga of David and Goliath, that he goes out to see his brothers, and says, "What are you all so scared of?" And he says, "Well, he's a giant, Goliath." And he comes out to do a one-to-one comment. It's interesting. The Philistines are on one side of the hill and the Israelites are on the other, and they taunt them, who will come out and fight against Goliath? And David says, "Well, I will." And of course he's got his slingshot and goes after him. They want to load him down with armor, and it's funny the way they tell the story because he can hardly walk with all the armor on, so he just wants his slingshot that he's used against wild animals.
You see that repeated on TV and on movies all the time, that type of story where
David and Goliath.
where they go out and somebody who has, stays light and doesn't have any huge swords or armor or anything like that.
Without this audience, I can share a joke that was shared at an academic conference of theologians, and it was about the transmission history and the way stories get preserved or changed or kept. And it's the story of David and Goliath. And there's a picture of Goliath, and he's all colored over, hovering over his private parts. And the writer is saying, let's just say you hit him in the forehead. But anyhow, whatever that is, this is the story that gets preserved in 1 Samuel 16. Next. Isaiah, later on, was very concerned about good leadership. That's one of the themes, and you see how political Isaiah is because he's very critical of King Ahaz. He expected that people would focus on the well-being of the community with particular concern for the poor and the needy and the oppressed. In Isaiah 7, we hear of Isaiah's disillusionment with King Ahaz, to the point where Isaiah declares Ahaz is certainly not a Messiah. As a leader of Judah, he declares that the nation will need to look for a future king who will be Emmanuel. And this is, of course, where the virgin birth story originates, because he says, a young woman will conceive, and she will bear a new son, and will call him Emmanuel. And in Hebrew, that's an Alma, a young woman. They don't distinguish between a woman who's had intercourse or not in the Hebrew text. Next, we go on to, because then a birth of a child, and it might be Emmanuel. We don't know who that was. It might have been Isaiah's own son with his wife. It could have been a son born in the royal house. But clearly Isaiah 9 that we use at Christmas all the time is the idea of a child born who will be the king. And remember, Isaiah from post-exilic era, this is in the past now. Kingship is gone when Isaiah is edited and expanded. And so they're dreaming of a future king, and this text is preserved. A child is born, a son is given, authority will rest on his shoulders. In other words, not Ahaz. His name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Beautiful poetry is there in Isaiah 9. Come on in, Holly.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Let's go on to the next one.
This is the next. I did.
That's it?
His authority will grow. Yeah, this is the text in Isaiah 9 that we know from Christmas so well. But to think that it's really talking about leadership. And when I say that Isaiah is political, it's because he's clearly talking about the way in which leaders influence a country or a community. If you have a good leader, you feel good. If you have a poor leader, you get all upset and you don't know what's going on. Mayor, governor, whatever level. Next. So, and then the other text that goes with it. 7, 9, and 11 are the major Isaiah texts. And I like to include chapter 32, which is not used somehow or other in our liturgy, but it's just as important. 11 we also know, and I call it the most important biblical text for thinking about good leadership. And I mean at any level, whether it be a mayor or governor or senator or pastor or judge. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, meaning a spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, and might, knowledge, fear of the Lord. To think about that in terms not just of Jesus, and not just of ancient King David, but of leadership in all time, in the biblical tradition of integrity in leadership. Next. Because he doesn't judge by outward appearances, what his eyes see. He doesn't decide with hearsay what his ears hear, but he judges with righteousness, and he decides with equity for the meek of the earth. Righteousness is belted his waist, and faithfulness is the belt of his loins. I used to do this with college students, and I think we should do it now, to talk about those two words that are the hallmark of the prophetic tradition in Isaiah and other prophets, righteousness and justice. If I take a chair and you come into this room and you look around in the room and you say, is there anything wrong here in the room? Maybe some books are out of order. If you look at this, that's tradition. It's born of our tradition of saying there's something here that doesn't seem right. And you want to you have an urge to say, well, like that. And now you don't even notice it because it's upright. And I think righteousness...
Because it's not in line either.
Not in line either. We want them in line because we like order.
Yeah.
But righteousness is just a biblical word for uprightness. And it's kind of an individual matter, righteousness. When the prophet talks about it, he's talking about people who are upright. For me, it has to do with integrity and it has to tell with truth-telling. Telling the truth. That's why I'm so upset when you see a culture that seems to be saying that there are so many levels of truth. You can say one thing one day and something else another day. There is such a thing as truthfulness, but it has to do with a learned tradition, our ethics that we have learned from tradition. But uprightness is righteousness. Justice has to do with you. And if I own land and you all work for me and I pay you a pittance so you can hardly live, that's not justice. Justice is community, equality of fairness of life, the right to have life and the ability to feed yourself and your family and to care for yourself in an upright manner. I had a man in my congregation who developed a new technique in a little firm that he worked for where there were only 3 or 4 employees, and it improved their whole line of work so well that his boss fired him. Didn't need him anymore. And he said, no, I can't afford you anymore, because he'd been there a while and had earned a good salary. And in 2 weeks, the guy bought an airplane just for his own enjoyment. And this guy was out of work, unemployed. There's something unjust about that. I don't know how we do that in our society, but we have all sorts of examples. When plants are closed, there's something wrong with that if they aren't thinking about the welfare of their workers. But for the prophet, it's justice and righteousness are the 2 keynotes, and the welfare of the community. Not liberty, not individual freedoms to make money and to get rich, but it's the welfare of the community is central. Okay? And then the messianic portrait that's lesser known in Isaiah 32. I think we should make more of this, Mandy, as we think. We aren't going to find this in the pericopes, but Isaiah 32 is this wonderful Messiah text. A Messiah text is one that relates to the ongoing king in Judah. From 1000 when Saul and David and Solomon were the kings to 587 when kingship ends. That's the Messiah era in ancient Israel. And you can just see the wonderful imagery here. The king should be like a stream of water in a dry place, like a shade of rock, of a great rock in a weary land, so that eyes can see and ears can hear. That's in contrast to Isaiah 6, where the judgment on the people was that even though the prophet spoke, they didn't hear his words and didn't understand. And this is, the king shows concern for the needy. Even the plea, when the plea of the needy is right, those who are noble will plan noble things. By noble things they will stand, says Isaiah 32. Kingship ended in 587. The boy king Jehoiakim had been taken to Babylon in 598, and then the Babylonians appoint his uncle, Zedekiah, and he serves only from 598 to 587, but he's surrounded by officials who are intent on independence. They want to get independent from Babylon, and more often than not, they get help from Egypt, and it's political independence is their goal. And if it costs them a couple thousand poor guys who are drafted into the army, so be it. But you see that it resulted then in incredible retaliation from the Babylonians who destroyed Jerusalem in 587. The last note we have about kingship is that in Babylon, in about 560, evil Merodach releases King Jehoiakim from Judah. He speaks kindly to him. This is the way the book of 2 Kings ends. And he gave him a seat above the other seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. And for his allowance, a regular allowance was given to him by the king, a portion every day as long as he lived. And there's been great academic debate whether that's a positive ending or a negative ending to 2 Kings. What was the author trying to say? In one sense, it's that he was given a place at the table in the king's dining room, symbolizing that he's a vassal king, of course, but it's every day as long as he lived, meaning this is written after the king died. We hear nothing about any children of Zedekiah. Zedekiah disappears totally, but Jehoiakim, the boy king, is in Babylon until he dies. And there's no song about some have tried to suggest Zerubbabel or Joshua, that some people had messianic claims coming back to Judah, but we don't know of that at all, and kingship is not reestablished. Under Persia, they become governors in Judea. Yahud is the Persian name for Judah. And Ezra and Nehemiah seem to be delegated by Persia to come back as governors, but there's no talk of kingship. And when Isaiah is edited and expanded, we're going to see at the end of Isaiah, there's very little talk about the Messiah. We get to the other tradition, which is servant of the Lord. Next. The servant of the Lord tradition is in Isaiah 41, 42, 49, 50, 52, 53, 61. And it's Ebed. We heard it today as slave, but the text is the same, slave or servant of the Lord. And in the latter chapters of Isaiah, the focus will be on the servant of the Lord tradition rather than Messiah. Messiah is only in 7, 9, 11, 32, in what we used to call First Isaiah, memories of the time before the fall of Jerusalem. We are left to ponder what exactly the authors are thinking as they describe the servant of the Lord. Who is the author thinking about? That's what we are asking. And I'm inviting you for this hour not to think automatically of Jesus. Think about 400 BCE when the book is written. Who is the author thinking about? Remembering the Babylonian captivity and earlier, okay? 42. When I taught these servant songs, I always said 3 questions. Who's the speaker in the poem? What is the servant to do? And how is he to do it? You tell me right here. Who is the speaker in the poem, according to the poet? Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He'll bring forth justice to the nations. Who's the speaker in the poetry?
God.
God, clearly. It's God speaking about his servant. So it's the servant of the Lord, and the Lord is speaking in the poem. The author has the Lord speaking. Okay? And what is he supposed to do? He will not cry out, lift up his voice, or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not rake, a dimly wick he will not quench. Faithfully bring forth mishpat, justice. He'll not grow faint or be crushed until he has established mishpat, justice in the earth, and the coastlines wait for his law. What is it he's supposed to do? It says it 2 or 3 times.
Bring forth justice.
He's supposed to bring forth justice, whatever just fairness in the earth, okay? And how is he to do it?
Quietly.
What?
Sounds like in the background, kind of quiet.
In the background, and certainly very carefully. What does that mean? He can walk through a field, and he doesn't get, he won't bruise a reed. He can go very carefully through a field. And a dimly burning wick, that means a candle. He can walk by it without punching it. It isn't making a lot of noise. It doesn't sound like a king, does it?
No.
It sounds like somebody else who's moving very gently. It sounds like a church librarian.
Or on the side.
Listen to me, this is the second one. That was 42. So that it was God speaking. The prophet was, or the servant is to bring forth justice, and he's to do it very quietly, very patiently. Second servant song, these are the 4 that Doom isolated in 1898, these 4 servant songs. And of course he was thinking about the New Testament and Jesus when he picked them out as servant songs that explain the life of Jesus. But we're trying to think about 400 BCE and asking who is speaking here and what is he to do and how is he to do it. Listen to me, O Coltslands. Pay attention. The Lord called me before I was born. While I was in my mother's womb, he named me. He made my mouth like a sword. The shadow of his hand he hid me. Made me a polished arrow. In his quiver he hid me away. Who's speaking?
Jesus.
Who?
Jesus.
The servant. I'm suggesting don't think about Jesus here.
Okay.
I mean, you may be right in a Christian sense, but I'm talking about 400 years before Jesus that a poet wrote these words. It's clearly the prophet, or the servant is speaking. Do you see that? The servant of the Lord is speaking, whoever he was. And what is he to do? Go to the next slide. Maybe. He said, "You're my servant in whom I'll be glorified." But I said, "I've labored in vain. I've spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Surely the Lord is with me. Reward is my God, with my God." What is he to do? Go to the next.
Glorify God.
Yeah, to glorify God. Go to the next one. The Lord has become my strength. Go to the next slide, Sue. He said, it's too late that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob, restore the survivors of Israel. This is an amazing text. In 400 years before Jesus, the servant is to be a light to the nations, that his salvation may reach to the end of the earth. The universal perspective. The servant is to proclaim good news to the world. And remember that we've got the memory of Cyrus of Persia liberating the people. And so there's already that universal picture that God is working through Cyrus. So what is he's to do? To raise up the tribe of Jacob and restore the survivors of Israel. And how is he to do it? Go back, Glenn. Go back, Sue. If you can go back, Sue.
I'll try.
Previous. Back one more.
More.
I'm honored because God has been his strength. He's to do it with the strength of God, that he is to proclaim liberty to Judah and be a light to the nations. We don't know if it's a king could probably have the power to do this. Go to the next slide. But it's clearly to raise up the tribes of Egypt. Go back one more. There's something I want to point out here in the previous text.
Go back.
She's earned her pay today, Joe.
There, right here. We'll go ahead. Go ahead, Sue, to the next. To the second servant, he's become, okay. What we are looking here is a tradition. In any culture, expectations arise for people in leadership. Traditions get established. In prophetic literature and biblical studies these days, we talk about tradition history. That's kind of a new science. What is a tradition for governors, for mayors, for senators, presidents, kings? In the biblical tradition, clearly for the servant of the Lord, like the Messiah, there was a kind of a tradition of expectations. How do we know who is a good mayor? How do we know who is a good senator? How do we know who's a good pastor? It's because we have learned a certain tradition with expectations of the kind of characteristics or attributes that that kind of person will have. And that's what we have with the servant of the Lord tradition. Go to the next one. Because the question is, in 50, the text for today, the servant is to be a teacher. It adds to that tradition of expectations, and there's a history to that. And I'm going to argue that the New Testament community said Jesus fits the tradition par excellence. It isn't promise and fulfillment. It isn't like magic that there was an old prophecy and then it's fulfilled in the New Testament. You can say that, but it isn't just a prediction and fulfillment. It's more a tradition that's established. And the early church wanted to say Jesus is the servant of the Lord par excellence. But Paul is going to see himself as a servant of the Lord. And indeed, the text even today, that you and I are the body of Christ. We're to continue the tradition. Do you follow that? So it's tradition history, I think, that we should see in the New Testament, not just literal fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. Yes, Andy?
Question about the word servant in Hebrew. I'm only asking because
Eved.
I'm doing Greek
Yeah.
translations, and in Paul,
Yeah.
servant is also doulos as slave.
Yeah,
Is it a similar
it's the same
sentiment
thing. The
in
Eved
Hebrew?
Adonai, the servant of the Lord, is an Eved.
Slave.
And an Eved can be translated slave or servant.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I had a question.
Yes.
Not a question, but today's sermon,
Yeah.
of course, I just forgot what I was gonna
Zechariah?
say. But yeah, it applied here. And I forgot what I was gonna say because I'm that old.
Are you talking about the reference to the riding on the foal or the colt, the foal of an ass?
Oh, yeah,
That's dual. That's
tradition.
parallelism in Hebrew poetry.
And
It's
Jesus-
just one animal. It isn't two.
But he was making sure that the tradition was followed and that each time, the details,
Yeah.
he went back and made sure that that happened, all the details that he
And I would-
had to be done.
Yeah, I would dispute Tim a little bit. That's Luke who's doing that.
Yeah, that's true.
It's Luke is doing that. He's saying when Jesus rides on the foal, a colt or the foal of an ass or something, he knows the ancient Zechariah, and he's building that up. But it's the memory that Jesus rode on an animal or something in Palm Sunday. Whatever happened, that's the historical Jesus quest. We really don't know because the Gospels don't agree. But it's quite close on the Palm Sunday memories that Jesus rode on a donkey or something as he went into Jerusalem. And then it hits him. Well, that's exactly what Zechariah was predicting. You know, so that whether or not it happened or whether or not it happened exactly as that, he's saying this is showing that Jesus is the Messiah coming. Okay?
Whether it happened exactly that way or not, the people knew exactly what to do
That's
because
right.
they had the tradition.
And Passover.
Yeah.
Passover is a tradition, so you do we'll do the same things on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday and Sunday. We're continuing traditions, okay? That's tradition history, and it's very important because there was a time 50 or 100 years ago, and still today in some fundamentalist churches, where they want everything to be prediction and fulfillment, just miraculous. I would contend it's not that, and it's far more rational and believable when you think about traditions that get established and that Jesus, I have problems sometimes when we say his only son, our Lord, because Son of God is a tradition throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, and we are all children of God. That kind of language sometimes bothers me because it's kind of like trying to say that Jesus somehow is this massive fulfillment of ancient prophecy, and that proves, of course, that Jesus is the Son of God or truth or something. You can't do that. You talk with people of other religious traditions and they say, yes, but you're creating your own proof. Okay? Anyway, this is the third servant song. We heard it today. Who is speaking? Clearly the servant is speaking. What is he to do? I've set my face like flint. I shall know I shall not be put to shame. And here again, who in the world was the author talking about? Even if this goes back to the Babylonian captivity era, I think it may, my guess is, I think it's somebody in Babylon who suffered. A prophet, a priest, some lonely figure. We do know that in Babylon, one of the modes of torture was to pull out the beard. We don't have anything like that about Jesus. Funny that we don't, that some first century person could have had some apocryphal story that Jesus, when he was being taunted by the guards or something, had his beard pulled out. This would be to fulfill what Isaiah said. You know, that would be the kind of story you could fulfill. You could draw on, but that he had his face pulled out or his beard pulled out, that I will not be put to shame. And they struck him, and that he was tortured or suffered persecution for his religious faith. Again, you look at Daniel, and that's legendary about Nebuchadnezzar and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three men in the fiery furnace. We are quite sure that's written much later in the time of the Maccabees, 167 to 67 BCE, because there are references there that apply to that era. But it's remembering back in Babylon these men of faith who stood up for the faith, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to have a purpose firm, dare to make it known. We learned that as a child, the song. And it's legendary, remembering men of faith who in the times of persecution stood up for faith. That somehow, that's what this third servant song is kind of depicting about somebody probably in the Babylonian captivity era. Who is the author speaking about? That's where, in the servant of the Lord tradition. Next. The possibility of whom the poet was speaking. C.R. North has written a book in which he has about 20 different possibilities of who the author was thinking of. And some of them are royal memories. Could he have been thinking about David, or Hezekiah, or Josiah, or Jehoiakim, the boy king who was exiled? I mean, he suffered, he had his kingship taken away. Or even Cyrus, the liberated of Judah, are royal possibilities. Or was he thinking about a prophet? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, an anonymous, that was, I was just talking about me, he's thinking about some anonymous figure in the Babylon, or the author himself of Isaiah 40 to 55, or Moses. collective understanding also is possible. We'll look at that in a moment because that's a Jewish interpretation, and I think we have to think very carefully about that possibility today because this was all, the servant songs were discovered by Christian theologians. Okay, the next one. In the Isaiah story, there seem to be several different perspectives who this was. My own conviction is maybe he's thinking about Moses. That seems shocking in some ways, but remember that Moses is the leader of the first Exodus, and the people in 2nd Isaiah are proclaiming there's going to be a new Exodus from Babylon back to Judah. They're convinced that the new Exodus is coming from Babylon, and so they're thinking about the figure who led them out of Egypt. Next slide.
Are they thinking a resurrection of Moses?
I don't know. No, just thinking that he inspired the tradition of the servant of the Lord, and that really what the author was thinking about is that there's going to be a new Moses among us.
So,
Yeah, you could argue that in prediction, with the New Testament community can say that's what they saw Jesus as the new Moses. You know, it's done. But Gerhard von Rad, who was my professor in Germany, really developed this thesis to think about Moses. There's one strand of tradition that we must recognize as important for the origin of these servant songs. That is of Moses, especially as he is represented in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses stands there as the prophetic prototype, the first of the prophets. Think of what he did, you know? Acts as a mediator between Yahweh and Israel. He suffers. He raises his voice in complaint. The way he bravely goes to Pharaoh again and again and again. Think of the plagues in Egypt and the way Moses has to go and say, let my people go. At last he dies vicariously for the sins of the people. He's not allowed to enter the promised land. He dies across the valley in Jordan. So that the servant Isaiah is a prophet like Moses. And in the Old Testament, Moses is 40 different times he's called a servant of God. Okay? Just an interest to think how the tradition develops and continues through Isaiah. Go ahead. Next, Sue.
This isn't the next. Let me go back.
This is a possibility that hasn't always been talked about, but there are two places in Isaiah 41 and 44 where it clearly identifies the servant as a community. And the question is this corporate personality, as we say, where you're thinking about the whole community as a servant community. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, you whom I took from the ends of the earth and called from the farthest corners, saying to you, you are my servant. I have chosen you and not cast you off. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be afraid, for I am your God. I will strengthen you, I will help you, I will uphold you with my victorious hand. And that's clearly a text that is sent to the community. And so maybe it's a communal understanding that the community in exile that have come through captivity and have learned humility in such a painful way, that they are now called to be the servant of the Lord, the servant community coming back to refound Jerusalem. In other words, the audience whom the editors of Isaiah are addressing. And that will be given even more strength, go ahead, because in the last chapters of Isaiah, it's going to be talking about the servants, plural, servants of the Lord, not just the servant of the Lord. This one, of course, is the major servant theme that is focused in the New Testament, and it's really amazing to read it and to wonder, is it talking about an individual or the community? It's overwhelming. And it's too much. We could do a whole session just on this text. But Isaiah 52, 53 have had more controversial discussions between Jews and Christians than probably any other biblical text. Because it says, see, my servant shall prosper. It begins by talking about his future exaltation. He'll be exalted and lifted up and be high. Just as there were many who was astonished at him. It sounds like the servant is already dead. So marred was his appearance beyond human semblance, his form beyond that of mortals. He will startle many nations. Kings will shut their mouths. What they see has not been heard, they will contemplate. Who has believed what we have heard? This is the suffering servant. And we know this from this coming week. You will hear it, and always in Lent, in the Christian tradition. To whom is the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty. He was despised and rejected, a man of suffering and acquainted with grief. As one from whom others hide their faces, despised, we held him of no account. Surely he has borne our griefs, our infirmities, carried our diseases, yet we have accounted him stricken and struck down by God and afflicted, wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole. By his bruises we are healed. It's really vicarious suffering. Therefore I will allot him a portion with the great. He shall divide the spoil with the strong. He poured himself out unto death, was numbered with transgressions. Yet he bore the sins of many, made intercession for transgressions. That's vicarious atonement. That somehow his sin or his death paid a price for others. And then we come back to, but anyway, you see that already then. The power of a text, that's 400 years before Jesus, talking about a servant, a suffering servant, servant of the Lord. Who that was and why that tradition was there, we aren't sure. But you can see why the New Testament community used that to interpret the life of Jesus. We know the disciples didn't understand Jesus. They left him and were hovering in fear. The women come with the news of the resurrection, and they think it's a joke, or they don't believe him. And Peter runs to the tomb, and you have all this dismay and misunderstanding, especially among the men, according to Mark anyway, and Luke as well. But in the early Christian tradition, this is now the third part of my presentation, Messiah, servant of the Lord, and then the New Testament interpretation of the servant, you have that they clearly saw Jesus as fulfilling that tradition, being part of that tradition of the suffering servant. I'm thinking of Matthew 8. That evening they brought to him many who were possessed of demons. He cast out spirits with the word, healed all who were sick. And this was to fulfill, says Matthew, the word that was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities and bore our diseases. Matthew is the one who is tricky because he is trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah and the servant tradition of the Old Testament. And Matthew does this again and again. He uses that formula. This happened to fulfill what was spoken. I would argue still that in Matthew 2, it's the tradition history that we're looking at. He's saying he's fulfilling the tradition of the servant of the Lord, not just proving prophecy and fulfillment. Mandy?
I'm curious, is it only in Isaiah 52, which is I think the slide before, where it talks about, it hints at the atonement idea? Or do you see that theme kind of running more deeply?
I'd have to explore that. That's a really good question. It's primarily there in 52, 53 in the servant songs, but it's clearly the servant is there for others, to be a light to the nations, and it has this global perspective already, which is not picked up on in Rabbinic Judaism. You still have Ezra talking about divorcing all of your foreign wives and very focused on purity of the tradition in terms of race and heritage. It's a major issue today. You've got a whole new resurgence. Rabbis who will not do intermarriage, and you have to convert to Judaism before they'll do a marriage, that sort of thing. I'll get to that. I think that's the newness of the New Testament, and it's kind of bold and pretty profound. The next. And then the last chapters of Isaiah, we are not going to hear about a singular servant, but rather about servants of the Lord. I think that's because the editors of Isaiah are addressing a community whom they are already saying, you are the servants of the Lord. In Rabbinic Judaism, 300 years before Christ, even the community at Essene, the Essenes at the Qumran, saw themselves as servants of the Lord. Question, what does that lead you to do? That's the question. But to me, that is the theme of Isaiah. Come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Come, let us be servants of the Lord. And they're challenged to be that. Our concluding poem this morning is that one describing the servant of the Lord in a special way. And I used it last week, but it's so profound. I think, as a word to us, as well as the tradition from 400 BCE, is the servant of the Lord. Especially anointed us. He's anointed the servants of the Lord to bring good news to the oppressed, binding up brokenhearted, proclaiming liberty to captives, release to prisoners. And you've been at a prison this morning, Mandy, is that right? You've been doing prison,
No,
Eric's been
Eric
doing
was.
prison ministry.
Yeah.
And Howie does prison ministry. That's exactly fulfilling this command of living out of this.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks for letting us
That
out.
you can bring good news to the oppressed, whoever they are. Release the prisoners, at least mentally, or the day of the Lord's favor, the day of vengeance and vindication is my word for nakam. The Hebrew word I think should be much more in vindication. It'll be a day when you prove that God is the Lord of righteousness and not just wanton chance in life. To comfort those who mourn, to give them garlands, I love that, to give garlands instead of ashes, oil of gladness instead of mourning, mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit, that we could be called oaks of righteousness. That's what servants of the Lord should be, oaks of righteousness. And that means uprightness, the planting of the Lord. Next. I'd like to reflect on that Isaiah text, which is used in Luke 4. It says Jesus read to the synagogue in Nazareth. Whether it was chance or what it is, it's Luke choosing to remember that. Jesus read just that text, Isaiah 61, in the synagogue. And then he says that when these actions are taken, the scriptures are being fulfilled. I think that's what he means when he says, today this is being fulfilled. I don't think he's just talking about, here I am, look at me. I don't think it's that. It's meaning when you see these kind of actions taking place, then you know that the scriptures are being fulfilled, that the work of the Lord is being done when people are giving garlands instead of ashes, when they're working with prisoners or sick people or oppressed. That's where you see it. I think that's what he's saying to the guys in Nazareth or in his own synagogue. And at first they're just marveling at him, and they praise him for his beautiful words. And my goodness, his man's been healing all over Galilee, and now he's come to Nazareth, and they're all excited about him. But then he says he remembers Elijah caring for a starving widow at Zarephath in Sidon. That's out on the coast. That's Phoenicia. Those are foreigners. And that starving woman is a foreigner. She's not a Jew. And he tells them that story about Elijah. Or he tells about Elisha going to cleanse Naaman of leprosy, and to remember that Naaman is a Syrian. And the hostilities also were already there between Judah and Syria. And suddenly the elders are enraged, and you have to wonder why. And I think it has to do with race and immigrants and dealing with the foreigner or dealing with the other. That provokes them to hostility, so much so that they drive him out to the cliff and they want to throw him over the cliff. And it says, and Jesus passed through the midst and went on his way. What is Luke saying there? Next. The newness of the New Testament. John Cobb said it once in a lecture, and it's really stuck with me. The unique feature of the New Testament is the embrace of the other. Our calling to be servants of the Lord, welcoming strangers. There's no longer Jew nor Greek, slave or free, no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. The text in Galatians 3:28, that all are children of God. That to me is the newness of the New Testament. We are affirming the whole Hebrew tradition, and we're debating what exactly it means, just as the guys who wrote in the Talmud, Midrash, and Gemara, and just as Isaiah, commenting on how to understand the Torah. And so Isaiah is such a pivotal book for me because it's like a platform for Jews and for Christians and for Muslims. We all draw from it as a sacred text. And I just conclude by saying I grow more and more convinced that growing up in Nazareth, Mary and Joseph and Jesus, in their home in Nazareth, knew the Pentateuch. They were literate. Jesus could read. And he knew the stories in the Pentateuch. And I think they knew the Psalms, and he knew Isaiah. I think Jesus grew up with Isaiah. Now, I'm a rationalist. I live in the 20th century. But I'm really convinced that Jesus grew up with this understanding of the servant of the Lord and knew about Cyrus of Persia, and he knew about the servant being called to be a light to the nations, and he knew about Elijah and Elisha going to foreigners, and that whole debate of who are children of God. Is it just the Jewish community? Or maybe it's Luke. And maybe it's just Luke who is making that story bold, because Luke is going to be talking about women, and he's going to be talking about an international calling of, and Paul, Jews and Gentiles, very prominent in Paul. Maybe it's just Luke and Paul who draw the implication. I don't think so. I think there's something already in Jesus' life and ministry that they're calling, and if anything, it is this idea of the embrace of the other. And that's why it's been so exciting to do this study of Isaiah. And I have more books here, but over 20 have been sold here at Ascension, and Steve is just taking 15 more for the Synod Assembly. I'm very excited at the responses I've had. Most of all, from Dolores telling me she's actually read the entire book, and my brother Harold in Billings, Montana has finished it, and it's just very, very satisfying. But thank you for coming. If you have questions, we have 5 minutes or so. Eric.
I just got just a reflection for you, Joe. I was sitting at University Village last Sunday afternoon listening to Amanda give the message.
Yeah.
And she picked up your book and quoted you and read from it as part of her message.
Well, I chose to talk on the Isaiah text. Last Sunday was 43. And see, I'm doing a new thing, can you perceive it?
Yeah.
So it was around
You know
that.
how important that is to me.
But I had several come up later, and were excited about your book, and I had a few people
You
bring
better
that
get
up.
me an invitation to speak up there at the book signing. I've had a visit with Leonard Schneiderman, who has the book and is reading it. But thanks to Howie and others, but I would love to have a visit up there, because there are a lot of people I know from Holy Trinity who are there.
Okay.
But it's just been very, very satisfying. Suddenly, Mandy remembers my teaching. You think you get a whole course or a syllabus and teach for a whole semester, and then it's gone, except what students remember. And in some ways, the satisfaction here is like, yeah, some of what I've taught is now in written form, and when you share that, it's very nice.
Well, this was really helpful. I have a class right now. It's called The Changing Face of Rural America.
Yeah.
And we're talking about all the different communities that are impacted by the immigrants and refugee communities that have come. What's church's place in that as churches are dying? And
Yeah.
Anyway, we spent a whole class looking at text, and one of them was that Luke text that was referring back to the Elijah and the Elisha story. So this was very helpful to cement it in my mind.
That to me is the real point of that Luke text,
Yeah.
is that Jesus talks about Elijah and Elisha and what their ministry was.
Yes.
And that's what gets him in trouble, because they switch so quickly. There's something about those references. I really believe that I mean, it's pretty bold what the New Testament as community is doing, especially Mark, is really saying that the Messiah and the servant of the Lord are one. You know, I was going to begin this session, and I said, with referring to the Philippians text, which is the epistle for today, and how political that is. We talk about separation of church and state as though the Bible should be totally neutral. The Bible is not neutral politically at all. And when we think of the Philippians text written in the Roman Empire, that's the origin before the First, Second, and Third Reich. The First Reich is with Charlemagne, 800 to 1800. We've got the First Reich, German Reich, and then Bismarck and the Second Reich, of course Hitler and the Third Reich, and they're all trying to pick up on memories of the First Reich, which was patterned after the Holy Roman Empire, in which this salute was Kyrios Caesar. You raise your arm just like that. I tried to do that with students, and I realized there are too many who did not want to do that.
No.
Yeah.
Kyrios Caesar, just because of the anti-Hitler feelings. But Kyrios Caesar was Caesar is Lord. And to bow your knee or to signify Hitler is I love the term Lord myself, Kyrios, because it means who's in charge of your life. It doesn't get into the God talk like Egypt has and ancient Babylon and others of who is God, but it's who is Lord, who's going to guide your life. And Philippians, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and everyone proclaim that Jesus is Lord. And we know that's an early Christian creed, that Jesus is Lord, Kyrios Jesu. Jesus is Lord, not Kyrios Caesar. That's very political, and it got a lot of martyrs in trouble. But all of that fits together here. Mark really brings together the Messiah tradition with the servant of the Lord tradition, because he depicts Jesus as a servant of the Lord, but then it's ironic Messiah. Does Jesus get a crown? Yes, he does. Crown of thorns. Does he get hailed by soldiers? Yeah, they mock him. They put him in purple and they strip him and mocking him. Hail, King of the Jews, and all of that. And does he get lifted up? The Greek word used for lifting up is exactly the same word as lifting up on a throne. Jesus gets lifted up and exalted, except his throne is the cross in Mark. So he gets lifted up and exalted. And what do they put over his head? Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Big joke. So the whole idea is like an ironic coronation procession in which they're saying that the king and the servant in the Christian tradition is the servant of the Lord. I find that very profound theology, but it's something we understand as Christians. And even they didn't know anything about democracy. Priesthood of all believers comes much later. But
So question, in Mark, it's the soldier that says that surely this was the Son
surely
of God.
this was the Son of
So it
God.
wasn't servant of the Lord, but it's not, to what extent is servant of God
Again,
and
that's a
Son of
play.
God
He's saying it's not Caesar.
correlated? Okay.
Caesar is not Son of God. This
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
this
This
servant.
is the servant.
But that's again Luke saying that about the servant.
Mhm.
How do you respond?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
I appreciate that. I'm getting another book because I've got a nephew who is in love with the Old Testament. I said, I've got a great book for you.
Steve tells me that they're now at 35. They've ended their 25% discount at Amazon. It's being advertised now at $35. They told me the list price was $36.50, so I get them for $18,
Yeah.
50% off for the author. So that's why I'm able to sell them for $20, because $47 for shipping and handling in addition to that. But that's
I'm
how.
going to get my billfold out of my car.
Yeah, there are some
I can
here.
get
If you
one
want
more
another
book.
copy at 20, I'm glad to do that. But thank you for coming, Mandy, from your work already. And nice to have you all here.
I'll be right back.
Thank you.
A lot to think about.
Yeah.
I need to ask you, Mandy.